Who are the ancestors of African Americans? Well, most African Americans believe that the majority of their DNA has roots in Africa, while the remaining has roots in Native American tribes and Europe. This is often backed by genetic studies that reveal that African Americans have 73.2% African DNA, 24% European DNA, and 0.8% Native American DNA. This makes everyone believe that they are majorly descendants of black slaves. But what if we tell you that it's wrong? You've been intentionally told so. In fact, studies reveal that about 98% of African Americans have Native American roots. So, why were you lied to and what do they want to hide? Let's find that out in this video. The Black History Archives, you would have never heard that tens of millions of Native Black Americans, or rather Indians, used to live before Christopher Columbus came to America. However, immediately after 1492, all of them disappeared. But where did they all go? Well, many were shipped to Europe and Africa as Indian slaves. That's when we realized that the story we have been taught about the slave trade is actually backward. Instead of a massive influx of Africans to America, black Indians were transported from America to Europe. From there, they were sent from Spain to Africa as commodities in exchange for African resources. These black Indians, now mistakenly identified as African Americans, were later shipped back to America and labeled as African slaves. This crucial part of our history is often neglected in school curriculums. Every European nation that colonized North America exploited Indian slaves for construction, plantations, and mining. These slaves were frequently sent to outposts in the Caribbean and Europe. Historical records, particularly those from South Carolina, the original English colony of Carolina established in 1670, provide the most authentic documentation of this practice. Between 1650 and 1730, it's estimated that at least 50,000 Indians, possibly more, were exported by the English to their Caribbean outposts. Many shipments were concealed to avoid paying government tariffs and taxes. Between 1670 and 1717, more Indians were exported than Africans were imported. Entire tribes in southern coastal regions were decimated by slavery more than by disease or war. A law passed in 1704 conscripted Indian slaves to fight in colonial wars long before the American Revolution. Indians found themselves caught in the colonial power strategies for economic control. The fur trade in the Northeast, the English plantation system in the South, and the Spanish mission system in Florida all caused major disruptions to Indian communities. Displaced Indians from the fur trade in the North migrated south. Plantation owners armed them to hunt slaves living in Spanish mission communities. The French, English, and Spanish manipulated the slave trade to their advantage. They negotiated the freedom of slaves in exchange for peace, friendship, and military alliances. For instance, the British established ties with the Chickasaw in Georgia, who were surrounded by enemies. The Chickasaw conducted extensive slave raids in the lower Mississippi Valley, selling the slaves to the English to reduce Indian populations and prevent the French from arming them. Ironically, the English saw this as a more effective method of so-called civilizing them compared to French missionaries' efforts. The Indian slave trade stretched from New Mexico, which was in Spanish territory, all the way north to the Great Lakes. Historians believe that every tribe in this vast region was involved in the slave trade, either as captives or traders. Slavery was a key part of the strategy to depopulate the land and make room for European settlers. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. As early as 1636, after the Pequot War in which 300 Pequots were massacred, the surviving Pequots were sold into slavery and sent to Bermuda. Major slaving ports included Boston, Salem, Mobile, and New Orleans. From these ports, Indians were shipped to Barbados by the English, to Martinique and Guadeloupe by the French, and to the Antilles by the Dutch. Indian slaves were also sent to Bahamas, often called breaking grounds, from where they might be transported back to New York or Antigua. Historical records show that Indians were seen as poor slaves. When not shipped far from their home territories, they easily escaped and found refuge with other Indian communities. They also died in high numbers during transatlantic journeys, and succumbed to European diseases. By 1676, Barbados had banned Indian slavery, citing their too bloody and dangerous an inclination to remain here. But how does it prove that most black people in America are descendants of native black Indian people? Well, as the Indian slave trade was replaced by the African slave trade by the late 1700s, Native American women began to intermarry with imported Africans. This produced mixed-race offspring whose native identities became obscured over time. The colonial project aimed to erase the presence of Indians, and these mixed-race individuals were labeled as colored people through bureaucratic changes in public records. In places like Virginia, even when individuals were recorded as Indians on birth or death certificates or other public records, these records were often changed to colored. Census takers, determining a person's race by their appearance, frequently recorded mixed-race individuals as simply black, not Indian. As a result, today there is a population of Native American heritage, particularly in the Northeast, who are not recognized by society at large. What's more, this suggests that Native Black Indians and Black Americans of today are the same. They share similar circumstances with the freedmen of the Cherokee and other 5 civilized tribes, as documented on the Dawes Roll cards by the United States Dawes Roll Administration. Interestingly, in early September 2015, Native American Indian tribes were awarded nearly $1 billion in a historic settlement. A total of 645 Native American tribes won settlements against the U.S. Department of Justice, amounting to $940 million. The U.S. government was fearful that more Native Indians, also known as colored, Negro, black, or simply left blank on their birth certificates, would discover their true history and heritage. This discovery could potentially force the government to grant them reparations and land. To avoid this, the U.S. quietly declared a deadline of December 31st, 2014, for these individuals to make land claims and identity claims. Even though the deadline has passed, thousands of Native Indians are still winning settlements through the U.S. Supreme Court and, more commonly, through the United Nations courts. But the question is, where did those black Indian Americans come from? Until now, it's established that most black people in America today have Native Black American ancestors. But we have to know who these Native Black Americans are. Dr. David Imhotep, a renowned historian and the first person to earn a Ph.D. in ancient African ancestry, offers a groundbreaking perspective on human origins. He argues that all humans, including Americans, trace their roots back to Africa. This view challenges the traditional narratives in American history books, which often start with cowboys and Indians. According to Dr. Imhotep, these accounts miss a much earlier and crucial chapter of American history, the presence and influence of Africans in ancient America. In his influential book, They Came Before Columbus, historian Ivan van Sertima explores various forms of evidence supporting the idea of an African presence in the New World long before Christopher Columbus' arrival. Van Sertima examines critical aspects to build his case. He looks into the sophisticated navigation and shipbuilding techniques that ancient Africans had, which could have enabled transatlantic voyages. He also draws cultural parallels between Native Americans and Africans, highlighting similarities in art, language, and religious practices that suggest historical connections. Van Sertima further investigates the transportation of plants, animals, and textiles between the continents, arguing that these exchanges indicate contact between Africa and the Americas. Additionally, he cites diaries, journals, and oral accounts of explorers referencing African peoples and their influence in the New World. Together, these elements create a compelling picture of African exploration and settlement in the Americas well before Columbus' famous voyage in 1492. Several historical accounts support Van Sertima's thesis. One notable example is a fleet launched by the Malian Empire in 1310, comprising 200 master boats and 200 supply boats. This grand expedition highlights the advanced seafaring capabilities of West African civilizations. Another example is a sea expedition led by the Mandingo King in 1311, further demonstrating the intentional exploration efforts by African leaders. The presence and impact of black Africans in pre-Columbian America are evident in the cultural and technological imprints they left on the civilizations they encountered. In his book, The First Americans Were Africans, Dr. Imhotep expands on these themes, calling for a radical reevaluation of traditional history. He emphasizes the importance of scientific and geological evidence in tracing the early presence of African peoples in the Americas. This evidence includes genetic studies, ancient artifacts, and geological findings suggesting that Africans were present in both North and South America long before the Vikings or Columbus. One striking piece of evidence highlighted by Dr. Imhotep is a photograph from the HMS Challenger expedition, which took place between 1872 and 1876. This photograph, currently displayed at the Natural Museum of London, shows a colorful display of African explorers in Tierra del Fuego, the southernmost region of South America. This image serves as a tangible reminder of the historical presence of Africans in the Americas, further supporting Dr. Imhotep's arguments. Ultimately, this suggests that the identity of Black people is too diverse to fit into a single label. They are Afro-Indigenous, Black Native, Indigenous and Black, Black and Native, or Black and a tribal identity. By honoring both their heritages, Black people challenge America's tradition of categorizing people into distinct racial groups. They resist societal pressure to choose between their identities based on appearance or perceived authenticity. Many blend their Black and Native identities by using traditional language or developing new expressions that reflect their unique heritage. Since the first contact between Africans and Native peoples, Black and Indigenous ancestors have built communities, formed relationships, and fought against systems of oppression unique to their communities, as well as those that overlap. Despite the hardships faced, Black and Native peoples have never been conquered. They have found ways to resist oppression, creating modes of defiance such as abolition, free towns, cross-cultural alliances, kinship ties, and community building. They have pushed for freedom individually and in solidarity, birthing enduring movements of resistance. What do you think? Are Black Americans descendants of Black African slaves or Native Indian American Black people? What, in your opinion, is the reason why they hide Black Americans' real ancestry? In the comment section right below, tell us whether you have had your DNA tested and know the percentage of Native Black Indian DNA you hold.